Welcome to the CEPA Podcast, the Center for European Policy Analysis, where issues that shape Europe and the transatlantic community are on the agenda. I'm Kari Odermann, and we're looking at Russia today, from its integration with the West to its isolation, through the eyes of two journalists. They're the co-authors of the recently published book, Our Dear Friends in Moscow, Irina Borogan and Andrei Soldatov. They're with me today. Their book, as I said, came out in June, and it takes a very personal look at propaganda and that space that's getting smaller and smaller for journalism in Russia. I'd also like to talk with them about the nuanced and often fragmented world of Russian dissidents in exile, and what kind of personal sacrifices are involved when you're labeled a Russian dissident. So stay with us as we explore this and other things. The first thing we're going to talk about is media repression. And Irina, you and Andrei left Russia in 2020 after Russian authorities canceled the media license for the news, the investigative journalism website that you were working on, agentura.ru. And authorities claimed that Andrei was dead. Irina, can you set the stage for us? What was happening in Russia in 2020 that made you see this series of events as serious enough for you to leave Moscow within the next 2 weeks?
Thank you very much, Kari, for having us here. And what happened in 2020? I mean, it seems like it's a long time ago, but I vividly remember what happened. Andrei opened his laptop, and he, out of the blue, he told me, "Oh, that's." He said to me, there's something going on. I can't understand why our license, the license for our website, agentura.ru, was cancelled. And I told him, check this. It was not a very important event for us, because to this moment, it is 2020. So the Russian democracy was dead for a long time, and we lived under constant pressure all the time, and we somehow got accustomed to that. But so we didn't. I didn't worry. I wasn't worried a lot about our license. So because agentura.ru already exists, semi-illegally. So, but what Andrei saw as an explanation of and how the authority explained why they canceled our media license was really shocking to me, because they explained that the person who is the owner of this website is dead. And this person was Andrei. He was editor-in-chief of the website. So, and he still is. And that was, the point is that have been living for so many years under pressure. We understood the risks. But at this moment, that was clear that it's an enormous risk, and it's a very direct hint that we have to go out of the country. What we did in literally 2 weeks. So we brought with ourselves only 2 suitcases. So because it was very fast.
And you were sure that it was the right move to make at the time. The signals were there that it would have been dangerous to stay, because it is also a huge risk. Leaving everything behind. It's also a risk for the people that you associated with. How did you deal with that?
The thing was that several things changed at the time in 2020. We got another journalist in jail on high treason charges. And that was very shocking for the entire journalistic community in the country. Of course, in 20 years after Putin came to power, we saw many things, including assassinations of journalists and poisonings and attacks. But to accuse a journalist of being a traitor, that was something new, and that happened in 2020. For us, the real choice was either we could stay probably in the country and forget about our profession, forget about being journalists, or to leave and at least trying to do what we believed and still believe is important to do, to keep doing our journalism. So to be honest, there was no real choice for us. There was a problem. There were, of course, some practical problems where to go to because it was a year of COVID. There were some other practical issues about our families and friends. But when you understand that it all goes down to this big question, whether you want to stay in your profession or you just become a private citizen, again, we just decided what we need to do, what we've been doing for so many years.
There's no explicit narrative in your book that addresses that the post-Soviet government has simply restarted some of the Soviet practices. You talk about the repressive policies, and there is now an illogical situation where many countries cooperate with the Kremlin, who refused to do that so during Soviet times because of the repression that happens. How do you make sense of that?
I mean, that's we live in the new times and the 21st century when we know that the Cold War finished, it ended, and the West decided that the West won the Cold War, which had never happened, but that was Gorbachev who won the Cold War, and he was the person who set people free in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and in the war. But the controversy which appeared after the Cold War, after the end of the Cold War, was not so strong as it used to be between the West and Russia, was not so big and so as it used to be during the Cold War. So Russia became maybe not a brilliant democracy, but kind of, and it was new capitalism, and it proclaimed itself not being the enemy of the world anymore. So many countries in the West, and of course not Western countries that established a friendship with Russia. So, and when Putin came to power, everything was kind of normal, and even when he rolled out his anti-democracy policy in Russia and his repressions, and even when he started attack the neighboring countries like Georgia, I mean, not a lot of countries were ready to accept it as a huge change and as a huge change in the world policy, and started doing something new against Russia.
A lot of these countries are reluctant to recognize the shift that took place. What responsibility do you think Western governments have when they engage with Russia and its expanding Soviet-style repression?
Well, we need to start probably in the early 1990s, when there was still a real chance to change things in Russia. I don't believe that actually anything could be changed after Putin came to power, because by the 2000s, the grievances against the West and hostility among many Russians against the West was very well entrenched. But in the 1990s, there was that chance. What probably we can say about the Western position was, of course, that at some point, many people, especially in the United States, accepted Boris Yeltsin as their guy, no matter what he was doing. And he was doing some really horrible things. He attacked his own parliament in 1993, and that was not met with a lot of criticism from the West, because the idea was that, look, he was fighting revanchists, a communist, and he could do that while using all means available, including tanks on Moscow streets, which literally shelled the building of the Russian parliament in 1993. Literally next year, and at the end of 1994, Yeltsin started his war in Chechnya. And again, foreign journalists were extremely critical of the war, but Western governments were not so much critical. And again, there was a space, there was a room back then to put and apply some pressure on the Russian government. If that point would be made, that you need to stop fighting your own citizens and you need to find a peaceful solution to this problem. That was never done. What happened next was, unfortunately, just something which would be difficult to avoid. Already in 1995, because the war in Chechnya was not a big success for Yeltsin, he started, and it was, again, I just wanted to insist on this point, it was not Putin, but Yeltsin, who started reinstating the powers of the KGB. The FSB became the FSB. Before 1995, it was FSK, which means counterintelligence, and K, and the name of the agency was replaced with B, which means security, which we all understand as a very broad term. It could mean almost everything from environmental security to political stability and security. The FSB got back their prisons, they got back their investigative powers, they got back at some point the department which was in charge of prosecuting dissidents, and all that happened before 1998, before Vladimir Putin became first Russian prime minister and then the president. So unfortunately, I think if we ever had any chances, during these 25 years, which chances we had probably only in the first half of the 1990s.
Let's talk about the trajectory of different post-Soviet governments. If you'll compare Ukraine and how their democracy has developed, what was the difference in the early 90s between what was happening in Kyiv and what was happening in Moscow?
In Moscow, there were a lot of protests. There was Yeltsin, and there was a huge discussions which turned into a real military conflict in Moscow between the parliament and Yeltsin, and it was a very vivid political life. In Ukraine back then, it was absolutely homogeneous picture. So nothing happened back then in Ukraine. There were a corrupted president Kuchma. There were no protests. I mean, that was vice versa.
That's different.
That was absolutely different. I mean, everything has changed in the 21st century.
And also I can add that the crucial difference, of course, between two countries, and not only between Russia and Ukraine, but also between, say, Russia and Belarus, was that Russia waged a really brutal and horrible and bloody war in Chechnya. And there was not such a war, say, in Ukraine. And of course, the war always affects the political climate, the political culture of the country. Every war, especially the wars like that, when the country fights itself, basically, its own territory, produces lots of corruption and essentially corrupts the society of the country.
That's how our old friend explained this process to us many, many years ago, that you can't make friends with a crocodile. It will eat you anyway.
Eventually.
The only thing you can do, you can buy some time, and that's all.
Before we dive into our next question, I want to give a quick reminder that for over 20 years, CEPA has been bringing top experts like you two together to provide unique insights about Europe and the world's evolving challenges. And I had mentioned before that both of you are CEPA fellows. And I've got another label for you, dissident. You are often described as being dissidents and dissidents in exile. And whether you like this label or not, Andrei, you're on Russia's official most wanted list, and you're a foreign agent. Your bank accounts have been frozen, and you've been targeted and harassed. And the only common denominator between Russian dissidents seems to be fighting oppression. But there's a lot of ideological differences between people who are labeled as Russian dissidents. And there's a risk when the West, people that don't understand the context, want clear, binary, moral narratives. What is the danger when wanting one spokesperson or one line of thought from Russian dissidents outside of Russia? This flattens the complexity of Russian society. And what is your own experience dealing with other dissidents?
You're absolutely right. There is a big temptation in the West to see just one organization and one leader, possibly, representing the position of Russian opposition or Russian immigration and political immigration in exile. And it's never been the case. It was never possible during the Cold War. It was not even possible before the Russian Revolution in 1917. Russian revolutionaries always fought each other, and the second generation of Russian exiles who left the country after the Russian Revolution also fought each other. They had horrible, horrible disputes, for instance, about the borders of the future Russian state. And of course, you had groups who had a really imperialistic views that the Russian Empire should be reinstated as it was, including Finland, for instance. And that was absolutely crazy. There were other people. There were social democrats. There are like revanchists of all kinds. But I think it's not really productive to think that such a huge community, and we are talking now about millions and millions of people who are either Russian-speaking or left Russia, or before that left the Soviet Union, or just ended up living in the former parts of the Soviet Union and still have some connections with Russia because we speak Russian, for instance, that you can find just one leader and one organization to represent them all. And I think, to be honest, it's not very helpful to have such an organization, because it would look like a Communist Party where you do not have any debates. You have very harsh discipline. You have one leader, maybe a Politburo, and everything is top down. I think, on the contrary, we do have and do need to have lots of debates, because we don't have really answers to so many questions. What to do with the Russian state after Putin is gone? What to do with Russian society? What could be the basis? I mean, how to start this process of reinventing Russia, because, of course, these days, the Russian narrative is captured and controlled by the Kremlin. These are really difficult questions to answer, and to at least to start finding these answers, we need to have a proper debate. We don't need just one leader to tell us what to think or what to do.
To have a proper debate, you have to have people to debate with. And there's a common practice of Russians not living in Russia that claim to be completely apolitical. By not having an opinion or avoiding speaking about that, are they inadvertently supporting what's happening?
Not all of Russians are like this. There are a lot of people who took to the streets to protest against something in Berlin, or against the Putin's war in Ukraine, in Berlin and other capitals. And of course, there were protests. Many people took to street when Navalny was killed in the Russian penal colony. So, but of course, very, very sadly, I have to admit that many Russians, they are apolitical because the last 25 years, since the moment when Putin came to power, there was so much oppressions and so much repression against people who were political, who took to the streets, who stand up for their rights, who express themselves on the social media, especially for the last 5 years. So that's invoke the old memory of the Stalin's times when people were punished for everything, and the best way to survive was to just keep silence. So that's a long tradition, and Andrei and I, we put a lot of efforts to explain to people that you shouldn't behave like this. You have to stand up. You have to take to streets. Otherwise, it will be worse for you. But it's a long way ahead. We have to go.
You mentioned Berlin, and the Kremlin has a long arm. In a park in Berlin, there was a hired killing that was traced back to the Kremlin in about 5 years ago. Once you've been labeled as a dissident, there are personal sacrifices. I don't know what your relationship is with people, family members still in Russia, if you have contact with them, if you're putting them in danger. But there is enough evidence of the Kremlin's activity outside of Russia, targeting dissidents, that you're also in danger now. How do you deal with that on a day-to-day basis?
Well, to be honest, the best way, or maybe it's just the way we always as journalists do with these kind of problems. And I discovered that very early on in my career when I found myself the very first time on a scene of a terrorist attack, that the best way to deal with it, with the stress, is to switch immediately into professional mode. And it helps a lot, especially when you see lots of dead kids, for instance, as we witnessed together in 2004 when the school in Beslan was taken hostage by terrorists, and after a disastrous operation, so many of his kids were killed and burned alive. And it was absolutely horrible, of course. But the only way to deal with this stress, as I said, is to think professionally about such a situation. What helps inadvertently is that before the book you mentioned, we co-authored another book, The Compatriots, which is exactly about the relationship between the Russian intelligence and security services and the emigration. And it also traces the way the Russian security were targeting Russian emigres, political emigres, starting in the 1920s. And when you think historically about this process, of course, you see many similarities. You understand that it is absolutely crucial for the Russian intelligence agencies to target Russian immigration because they develop a really huge paranoia about immigrants. And we sometimes think that it's absolutely crazy because we don't represent such a huge threat, obviously, but it's not that for the Kremlin. Also because they believed that they have a very primitive picture of what actually happened in 1917 when the Russian Empire was destroyed. They believe it was destroyed by a group of Russian immigrants. And that is why they think, well, if that was such a mighty empire was destroyed by a small group of insignificant immigrants, why another group of immigrants couldn't do the same now? Of course, they do not think about the role of, for instance, of the First World War, what role that war played in the destruction of the Russian Empire. They see only that. They see the role of the Russian immigrants, and that's why they became so paranoid and so aggressive towards Russian immigrants. So yes, my answer is that you take all these risks professionally, and that helps.
But that put a lot of restrictions of our daily life, and I don't like that because, we have to be You have to be. You can't make friends with strangers. You have a filtered circle of friends. You can't go. I mean, they can't support a lot of relationship with Russian diaspora here in London because it could be it is infiltrated by the FSB agents. And I mean, like just a simple thing you can do. You can't drink alcohol in nightclubs and feel yourself free. So that's very, very sad. But I mean, we will survive.
I know that you have very valuable contacts in Russia that help you understand what's happening there better. You didn't mention anything about your families and contact with them still in Russia. What does that look like? Have you broken off contact?
No, of course we are in touch with our families, but my father was sent to jail in July 2024. So he was sent to Russian jail, and it was horrible for our family. I just didn't want to bring this personal moment because we are talking about things which are way more important than our personal situation. But of course, I can say that it's a huge problem for most of Russian journalists in exile. And I should mention that the big exodus of Russian journalists from Russia became a year before the full-scale invasion started in 2021. And this is why now most of Russian journalists, professional journalists, are out of the country. And of course, all of us have relatives in the country, and it's difficult psychologically and emotionally because you cannot travel to this country, and because, look, this war already lasts more than 3 years, which means that people, for instance, they get sick, sometimes they die. And there's a new service, for instance, which was launched quite recently by Russian immigrants, that you can attend to funeral remotely. And it tells you something about the situation, unfortunately.
Thank you for sharing that. I didn't mean to get too personal. It's important for people to understand this concept, though, because there's so many misconceptions about what Russia is, who Russia as a culture, how it's developed. And I'm sure you spend a lot of your time explaining the complexity and the nuances. And your book was around 350 pages, Our Dear Friends in Moscow. And you do some hand-holding there, and you explain the slow slide of people changing, people choosing, people justifying their actions in an authoritarian regime. Both of you are here together today, and I wanted to ask you about the importance of your work together over the past 20 some odd years. And if you would have made different decisions, if you wouldn't have had someone that you could say, did you just see that? Did that just happen? Am I interpreting that the right way? Was this back and forth between the two of you professionally valuable for the path that you chose?
Oh, yes. To be honest, sometimes I think it was absolutely crucial. I remember the night after the end of this horrible operation in October 2002, when the Moscow theater which was taken hostage by terrorists in Moscow, and the FSB launched an operation to release the hostages, but it ended up in a disaster because they pumped poisonous gas into the theater, and so many people died. And we witnessed that firsthand because we were really close to the theater, and we looked at in horror how the Russian soldiers were bringing bodies of people out of the theater, and they were just lying them on the floor. And the first was the first level of people, and then the second one came, and you think, if you lie people in this manner, it means that they are dead. And you start counting, and you and you fail because there are so many bodies. And I remember after that night, we came home and I was so exhausted. I said, look, Irina, we probably need to get some sleep. And Irina said, no. And now it's time for you and me to start writing. And she literally forced me to sit at a computer, and we were writing like crazy, this big story, which again, led us into some problems with the FSB, but we did it immediately when our memories and everything was fresh. And you understand when you're getting more experience that that's exactly what you need to do. You need to write down everything you remember immediately, because things are getting distorted. You think what you remember things, but actually you don't. So it's better to do it immediately. And it really forced me to do that.
Yeah, I did. That's true.
So the cooperation between the two of you has been helpful in helping.
Otherwise, I mean, I think otherwise we couldn't survive, because being under pressure for so many years, I mean, at one moment you just couldn't do this anymore. But when there are two of you, so that's much easier, and that's absolutely, you understand each other. You are always together, and I mean, you don't need to explain to another person that why you're always talking all this shit, all this terrible stuff. That's, I mean. You can't do anything else. You can't. So, so that's much easier. I recommend to work together for all the reporters in the world. So.
When I was looking through your book, it had some parallels for me with Anne Applebaum's Twilight of Democracy, where she also talks about choices friends and colleagues made about choosing a more democratic or more authoritarian path. And there are so many ways someone can be lured into authoritarianism. How fragile, in your opinions, is democracy?
It is, unfortunately, it's very fragile for several reasons. One of them is that there was a mistake made by many Western public intellectuals at some point, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when lots of people started thinking and saying that democracy means prosperity, and that democratic countries are, by definition, are more successful economically. It was such a horrible argument to make, because, of course, it's not true, and you can find plenty of countries which are not extremely democratic, like Singapore or even China, and they're quite prosperous. So you cannot really make that argument, because that makes democracy weak, because democracy is not about money. And we need to understand that. Democracy is about our freedoms, and that is much more important than money. Because at the end of the day, these freedoms and the institutions, they give you the place and time to, enjoy your prosperity, enjoy your way of life. And that was completely missed by so many people in Russia who started, when we got this economic, boom in the early 2000s. A lot of our contacts and friends, they started like building huge houses and mansions around Moscow. And it looked like they're trying to protect themselves behind these high fences. But you cannot get that kind of protection in a country run by a dictator, because, of course, you don't have these powers. And you need to put this dictator under control. And that was something we all, Russian intellectuals and journalists, we failed to explain to our people. But I think, unfortunately, in many countries, it's also not really clear that democracy is not about money. Democracy is not only about elections. Democracy is something about, again, freedoms and institutions. It might sound boring, but these days we understand that actually it's extremely important.
And to me, the most fragile thing in democracy is the liberal democracy, because to explain people why they need to protect the rights of minorities, that's very difficult nowadays, because the most of people, they are majority. So why to fight for other people's rights? And I'm very afraid that it could fail into the abyss that the world, with Europe failed into the 30s in the last century. So what happened in Germany, what happened in other countries. So if you're not ready to protect the minorities' rights, you can be in this abyss.
We're going to have to wrap it up. I could talk to you both for hours. My final question is going to be, you've experienced and documented so many upheavals. What do you want people to understand about what's really at stake in Russia today for ordinary people, for its future, and for the rest of the world?
First of all, we need to understand that there is a big temptation to forget about the country and to throw the key. That is absolutely impossible. It is a huge country, and it would remain a huge country for the years to come. And it's about 147 million. It's a huge country with a huge potential, with very smart engineers and smart IT entrepreneurs and smart people. We cannot isolate such a country. It's just absolutely impossible. That is why it's absolutely crucial to find a way how to change things in the country and how to find a way to change it and to change the national myth which exists in the country, I mean in Russia. And one of the most important thing about Russia that has been always used by the Kremlin, from the Tsars to Lenin to Stalin to Putin, is that Russia has been always unique. And when you promote this idea of uniqueness, it doesn't matter it was unique in a bad way or in a good way. It means that there are no examples to follow for such a country because it's been always so unique. And it also means that for people who are fighting for democracy inside the country, there is no hope, because you can always say, look, our country has been always unique. There was no democracy in our country. Look at Ivan the Terrible or Peter the Great, or all these czars, and examples from Europe or from the United States are not applicable. But they are, because right now we live in a globalized world, and things which are happening in Russia affect the entire world. And the things which happen in the entire world affect Russia and people who live in Russia. That we need to understand and remember.
Thank you, Andrei. Irina, would you like the final word today?
I think the West should put more efforts into sending message to ordinary Russian people that the West is not in the war with ordinary Russians. The West only in the war with the Kremlin, and that's difference. Because people in Russia, they very often don't understand that. They think that it might be that the West is against them, which is not true.
An important point, especially in the age of social media and how people can reach out to each other.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of the CEPA Podcast. I've been speaking with Irina Borogan and Andrei Soldatov. They're the co-authors of the recently published book, Our Dear Friends in Moscow. Thank you both.
Thank you very much for having us here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kari.
And thank you for tuning in, and stay with us for more insightful conversations on the CEPA Podcast, where we're going to continue to explore issues that shape Europe and the transatlantic community. If you found this discussion valuable, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss another episode. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And if you want to dive deeper into the issues shaping transatlantic policy, visit CEPA.org, where you'll find expert analysis, research, and a lot more. And you can find CEPA across social media for the latest updates and thought leadership and exclusive content. I'm this episode's host. I'm Kari Odermann, And I'm also a CEPA fellow. Thank you for listening.